Glad you're here. Keep coming back. It's my honor to introduce Alexandra Phillips, who will be the speaker today. She holds a JD, a Juris Doctorate, from the University of Pittsburgh, an MA in Industrial Organizational Psychology from Harvard, and degrees in Fine Art. So this should resonate with William and Mary people. It's broad and interdisciplinary in many ways. She is recognized for her pro bono work on human rights issues, notably representing the family of Marc Fogel, a wrongfully detained American in Russia. She is actively involved in initiatives promoting human rights and pro bono legal services. She is experienced in both domestic and foreign legal matters, and she has received many awards. One of them is Have a Heart Humanitarian Award from the Oil Painters of America for using art as a tool for wellness. So with that basic information, and I hope you learn much more about her and from her right now, please join me in welcoming Alexandra Phillips. Thank you.
Well, thank you all very much, first of all, for this wonderful introduction, and also for this great opportunity to be here and to speak to you. I do go by Sasha, so we have two Sashas in the room. It'll be easy to remember. I am a trade attorney by trade, and up until about 3.5 years ago, that trade did not involve hostage negotiations of any kind, hostage work. So this is very, very brand new to me. What I learned during the course of this engagement on this case that I'll tell you a little bit more about is that there are no experts in hostage diplomacy. And this is even though hostage diplomacy itself, or if we use simpler terms and don't dress them up, hostage taking, well, that is as old as the world, right? It goes back hundreds, thousands of years. However, there is no pattern that you can follow. No one can tell you, hey, if you do this, file this, follow this protocol, you're going to have a good result. And it's for a variety of reasons, some of which we're going to unpack in the next 30 minutes. How many of you have heard of Marc Fogel? Okay. For those of you who have, what I'd like you to do, there's not going to be a test on this, I promise. What I'd like you to do is note 3 things you did not know about Marc Fogel until after this presentation. You don't have to tell me what they are, but sort of like, keep a mental note of what you're hearing. So as I mentioned, the topic of hostage diplomacy or hostage taking somebody and trading them for whatever it is that you need is very old. And it comes up in a variety of ways. Before we get to Marc Fogel and who he is, because the devil is in the details, and in this case it's going to be in the context, we're going to get a little bit to the context. So how many of you have heard of the Anglo-American school? Okay. There is an Anglo-American school. So this school is a school that serves children, for the most part, of diplomatic missions in foreign countries. And those diplomatic missions, in the case of Russia, initially included UK, United States, and Canada. It was established, the Anglo-American School Moscow was established in 1949 by a decree signed by Joseph Stalin. And it was given a building on the outskirts of Moscow that eventually grew into a beautiful, beautiful campus. The school functioned as a school for children of the US, UK, Canadian, and other English-speaking diplomats who came to Russia who wanted their children to receive an education comparable to what they would get in their native country. And so that's how this was established. It involved a variety of teachers from those diplomatic missions and others. And it functioned as a closed school for the most part. During the fall of the Soviet Union, or after the fall of the Soviet Union rather, the school opened up to a variety of students and invited others to come and study. And eventually, children of Russian oligarchy, chinovniki, apparatchiki, right? So of prominent Russian citizens were able to attend the school for a certain fee. That's how the school was able to expand its campus and build it into a state-of-the-art facility. Some trouble in a paradise started happening around 2010. So we're not talking about the recent times, we're going back a little bit, right? In 2010, the Russian government closed a chapter of the school that was opened in St. Petersburg in response to the bust of the sleeper cells, if any of you remember Anna Chapman or reading about her, whatever else. So there's a bunch of spies that got sent back, or spies that got sent back to the Russian Federation. As a response, Russian Federation took some retaliatory measures, including closing down the school in St. Petersburg, taking away that campus, that building, saying, okay, you had it, that's great, now it's ours, goodbye. And starting to sort of tear down some of the foundation that the Anglo-American school Moscow enjoyed. Fast forward a little bit to the closer times, 2014, there was another hit. This is the annexation of Crimea, and so the relations between Russia and the United States soured a little bit further. And 2019, where you see this little excerpt from the Moscow Times article, which you can find in the in the U.S. National papers as well. I think the New York Times was the one that reported the most on it, where the school, the Russian government, said, okay, we are going to take the school from the governance of the diplomatic mission. We're going to make it subject to the Ministry of Education of the Russian Federation, which meant that it had to go, through certain accreditation and everything like that. And we're not going to we're going to start counting, the diplomatic visas that we issue to the teachers who came to that school up until this time against the full quota issued to the United States, meaning the United States consulate had to pick and choose who they, gave those visas to, or who would be able to receive those visas, the diplomats, the consulate staff, and/or the teachers. And so about 80 teachers, don't hold me to that number, but about 80 teachers lost their diplomatic status, lost their diplomatic visas, came in as teachers normally would to the schools in the Russian Federation to teach children. And that gets us to Marc Fogel. So Marc Fogel is a native of Butler, Pennsylvania, currently lives in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and he's back to Pittsburgh, which we're very happy about. And he has taught in the Anglo-American school by the time he was arrested for 9 years. This was going to be his 10th and last year. And unfortunately, when you say, well, this is my last year, or this is my last, whatever it is, things happen sometimes. What you might have read in the press is that he took some marijuana with him to Russia, got arrested in the airport, had a canine tip, so a dog picked him out, and he was arrested and charged with the Articles 228 and 2291 of the Russian Federation for smuggling drugs. That is part of the story. Again, you look at the details and you look at the context. Marc Fogel did bring about 17 grams of marijuana into the country. This marijuana was prescribed to him by an American doctor, by Dr. Spar, to treat his debilitating pain, his pain management, from spinal stenosis. He had several surgeries. This medical issue that he had spanned to 1990s, so over 30 years. He'd had debilitating spinal stenosis. The disease was degenerative in nature. He had muscle atrophy. He had replaced joints. He had various surgeries. And so he was in consistent pain for the most part. It varied, went up or down. For the most part, he was prescribed, initially at least, opioids. As a teacher, right, it knocked him out. He was not able to interact with students. And as I learned from all those letters that started pouring in as we're working on this case, what a teacher he was. Marc Fogel, for the most of his career, taught in South Americas. He taught in Middle East. So he was a teacher who went abroad and taught American kids or English-speaking kids wherever he went. And so Moscow, again, he spent there about 9 years. He was very engaging. He was a history teacher. And so his class, there's usually, all of the students who attended his classes said how wonderful he was. He told all these stories. He moved around. He made his lectures exciting. His wife taught with him. She also taught various subjects, including the Anglo-American school. And as a family, they traveled quite a bit. Marc brought his medication with him. Hasn't been an issue. This particular time, now remember, he no longer has a diplomatic visa, right? So he goes to Russia with his prescription card, with a stack of medical records, translated, proving that, he in fact has those issues. And he plans to bring this medication with him in accordance with the Russian law. We'll get to that part in a little bit. But there's a little element there, right? Because if you watch the videos from the airport or whatever the news are reporting it, you see the canine, you see the dog coming in and sniffing and wagging its tail and bark, bark, and there he is, right? The dog came later, much later. In that little excerpt that you see highlighted, this is the actual sniff from the verdict that sort of got copy-pasted from the initial indictment. If you read it, it talks about a tip, a report that was sent to Sheremetyevo, and it was sent well before Marc Fogel ever traveled to Russia that summer. The report was sent in August of 2021, in the beginning of August. Keep that in mind, that August of 2021 is going to come up several times. Marc was arrested, I believe it was on the 21st of August. This report came in before. And in some bits and pieces of the verdict and indictment, there's actually a reference to it coming in even earlier, even before August. This report, it wasn't an immediate tip like, hey, we got this news, somebody is coming in, we got to grab him. Not at all. There was a memo created based on that tip. The memo, if you know anything about the system of bureaucracy and how it works, the memo was vetted by the higher-ups, and they said, yep, green light. The informant was never disclosed, even though we asked at trial for that information. But I'll help you connect the dots a little bit. The dogs, from what we understand, were brought in later for the video. So you have a pretty video to release to the news that there is a dog sniffing a suitcase. Even if the dog was sniffing a suitcase, even if the dog passed by that suitcase, it wouldn't have picked up a scent of anything because, cartridge is apparently oil. I didn't know this at all, but apparently the dog cannot sniff oil, hashish oil or whatever else, simply because it's sealed and it's in glass containers. Anyway, so about that Russian law, right? Because a lot of reports said, hey, he broke the law, he came into the country, he deserved what he was going to get. So there is a directive. And this directive, where it shows up in public, is during the 2018 sports event, right? It was sort of widely publicized, where it said if you have a prescription drug that is prohibited for circulation on the territory of the Russian Federation, you can bring it with you with the prescription card, whatever prescription card you have, and as long as you declare it, so as long as you go to the customs desk, fill out a declaration, show them what you have, show them the reasons for bringing it, you can take it with you. And, Moscow Times published this with references to whatever decree that allowed this, and just basically said that, hey, the enforcement is now going to be on the customs. They're going to take a look at it. If you're fine, they're going to let you into the country. If not, they're going to confiscate whatever it is that you have, but no one's going to slap you with a Article, 228 or 2291. And so that's where Marc was heading, with this prescription in hand and the medication, the medical marijuana. In his suitcase, he was heading to the customs desk. His suitcase was being watched, again, based on the verdict, from the moment where it got entered and tagged in New York. And so they followed the tag. As soon as the suitcase hit the conveyor belt, they watched for Marc to pick it up. He did. They stopped him before he got to the customs desk. Right? So no longer this guy has an opportunity to declare anything because he's being first stopped and then arrested for smuggling controlled substance into the Russian Federation. And then we get to some dots that I'd like you to connect. So I don't know if you recognize in this picture, it's not the best one, it's off of social media, but one of these gentlemen is Sergei Lavrov, right? The other one, who referred to Sergei Lavrov as his uncle, although I don't think it's a familial connection, it's more of a, Dядя Vanya. It's more of a term of endearment or term of respect in the Russian language. His name is Ilya Pekshev. Ilya has worked at the Anglo-American school as an IT. Now, I don't claim to be an expert in spy games or anything like that, but I'm going to refer to Ambassador Eric Rubin, who was in charge of the board of directors of the Anglo-American school, was served at the Russian consulate for quite some time, was an ambassador to Bulgaria. He said, oh my goodness, anybody who works in IT in any kind of American organization out in the Russian Federation is probably sending this information to someone. So Ilya Pekshev worked in IT for quite some time, and he got reprimanded during his time at the Anglo-American school for all sorts of efforts, fairly overt, to sabotage the workings of the Anglo-American school. At some point, I think that this was the straw that broke the camel's back. He sent an email, circulated an email to everybody urging them to go to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs to get an appointment with Sergei Lavrov and to tell him that they would like to get their school back, meaning into the Russian governance, because apparently the US was not doing that great of a job. So Ilya Pekshev works very closely with Marc and with everybody at the Anglo-American school. He knows very well, presumably, the content of the emails that are going back and forth, potentially including some type of medical issues that Marc, in one of those videos where they show a search of the school, because they floated, so by they I mean like the Ministry of Internal Affairs, floated this idea that Marc was running a drug cartel, supplying drugs to the students in the school or something along those lines. The allegation is so outrageous, it did not even make it into the trial. Although, you can make stuff up, obviously, if you want to, but they decided not to do that. But anyway, so in that video, they show a search with the dogs and everything else going through Marc's classroom at the Anglo-American school, and you see them going through his mail. You see UPMC envelopes, right, from the University of Pittsburgh Medical Center. So they've gone through those. Likely, if Marc received those at school, he probably received some emails back and forth from UPMC, including some of the pain management or whatever prescriptions that he had. And so Pekshev had access to this. If you look at his social media, this is from Facebook, he was not a big fan of Anglo-American school. He even put it in English and Russian. He got fired in August of 2021, right? All sort of comes together. And for those of you who are familiar with Russian history and lore, right, we say, совпадений не бывает, right? There are no coincidences. So things just beautifully line up for August 2021. Chances are something's going on there. Anyway, and another fun fact about Russian lore is there is a saying that if he who comes to aid first, chances are the one who sets you up, right? So this lovely gentleman, as soon as Marc is arrested, knows about this, just like this. Calls Jane, his wife, and says, oh, I just heard Marc's arrested. Marc's arrested, says Jane. Oh, yes, but I will help you out. Here's my attorney who can help Marc out, who can get him out, not going to be a problem. We'll do this. And so for a period of time, until I finally put my foot down and fired that legal team, the dream team as we called it, this gentleman, Ilya Pekshev, and his very good friend, Alexei Taratuhin, who you may know if you followed the Pussy Riot trials, represented the Russian Orthodox Church and all of the parishioners whose feelings were terribly hurt by these girls in balaclavas, right? So he also represented Marc Fogel, for a hot second until we finally said, that's probably not a good idea. Anyway, so to wrap up the Anglo-American school, shortly after Marc's arrest, which of course was very widely publicized, and there was this theory floated that here's this American teacher who's selling drugs to our poor children, the school, so that Ministry of Education, right, that I mentioned before, that they were now subject to, said that the school was not properly operating. There were some translation issues or whatever else. It was very, very minor, but the school was eventually shut down, and the building and the campus was closed off. So the school is no more. So the purpose for which Marc was arrested, well, there were two, right? One, to get a hostage. And again, this is my opinion. As somebody who's worked on this case for 3.5 years, you can form your own, but just bear with me a little bit. And two, to tear down the school. Those two objectives were accomplished. So we get to the trial, the sentence and the appeals. Химкинский городской суд, which handles all of the cases coming out of the Sheremetyevo airport, and so it's going to have a lot of precedent on the drug cases. And I'll mention that the Russian law is not precedential, as a matter of fact, so you can point to a decision that this very judge had made very recently and say, but Your Honor, will you sentence this person to 6 months probation, and you sentence my client to 14 years in a maximum security labor camp? What's up? And the judge's response could be, and was not precedential. I can do whatever pretty much I want. So Химкинский городской суд in June of 2022, so this is about a year out, and remember during that year, the invasion into Ukraine happened, right, in February of 22. So whatever abysmal relations, diplomatic relations between Russia and the United States that existed before that took a severe nosedive. The consulate staff went to, I'm not even sure that's even a skeletal crew at that point. It was like literally 3.5 people, which were very difficult to get hold of for a good reason. And at this point, also another aside, Marc is just an American detained abroad. He is not wrongfully detained. I'll get to that in a second. He's just detained. So all that the consulate has to do is to make sure that he is, somewhat alive, visit him every now and again. And that was difficult because COVID restrictions were still in place somewhere. The Russian penal system was sort of slow to catch up to the ease of the restrictions. So there were all sorts of hoops that he had to jump through. Following Marc's arrest, Brittany Griner was also arrested. Same articles, 2291, 228, different parts because of the volume. Another fun fact here, so when somebody tells you they're an expert in hostage diplomacy, they're not. They cannot be. There is no pattern, right? I mentioned there is no protocol. Brittany Griner's lawyers were fantastic. We're sort of following in our footsteps because we were first to go, seeing how our strategy worked for us and trying to sort of follow along. So her defense was very, very similar to ours, literally followed in our footsteps. Химкинский городской суд slaps Marc Fogel with a 14-year sentence, Brittany Griner with a 9-year sentence. I'll get to the statistics a little bit, to the precedent, right? During the trial, there were all sorts of violation of the trial procedure, and our Russian team basically threw up their hands and said, hey, that's not even worth it bringing up on the appeal because no one's going to pay attention to that. We do have that, one thing where the 14-year sentence is really, really just unprecedented for this sort of crime. And so really the same thing that happened to Griner. The verdict, which was, I believe, 15 pages, the judge deliberated following the closing arguments, which, by the way, were not translated for Marc, so he sort of couldn't really tell what was going on. His last words to the court were also cut very short because the translator that was approved for him, who was translating this into Russian, all of a sudden got reprimanded by the judge and sent out of the courtroom, and no one cared to listen to Marc in English. Anyway, so it took the judge, I think, less than 15 minutes to deliberate and return a 15-page verdict. It's kind of like a minute per page, highly packed with all sorts of information. And I think for Brittany Griner, it was very similar. The appeals, the first appeal, there was a hearing, there was a deliberation. It got denied also like within 15 minutes. The second appeal, that one was to an independent panel. The panel actually yelled at a lawyer presenting this appeal, and that the lawyer wasted the panel's time in bringing this crap in front of the esteemed judges. That was the workings of the Russian system. So following that and realizing, and the Supreme Court threw it out without even taking a look at it. I don't think we had a judge look at it. I think it was just a clerk that basically stamped it as denied or rejected. They never took it. Following that and realizing that we had no other recourse in Russia. And by the way, meanwhile, we've been talking to the State Department about all of this and saying, hey, what do we do? What do we do? Do we go public? Because again, it's a very difficult decision to make. You're not just making a decision about, sell, buy, export, import, whatever. You're making a decision about a person's life, right? So you want to be really, really, really careful and talk to as many people as you could. And so everybody we spoke to, including the Secretary of State indirectly, family met with Jake Sullivan, met with several other officials. They said, hey, keep it quiet for now. We're doing everything we can. You never know. Russia may just let him go. I'm not sure why they were optimistic. We were not, but we decided, hey, they know better. Following the complete failure of all of the appeals, we decided to basically grab onto all three branches of the U.S. government and just mount a full force attack and include the public into this as well. So we've approached the members of the Congress, and they've passed several resolutions, one of them for the Russian Federation to let Marc go, another one to the State Department to issue a report on how Marc is doing and why hasn't he been designated as wrongfully detained. Now we get to the wrongfully detained. If you're just detained, you could be rightfully detained or not wrongfully detained. I still don't understand all of that, but you can only be wrongfully detained if, under the Levinson Act, passed in 2020, you satisfy one or more of the 11 criteria under the Levinson Act. Marc satisfied, as we argued to the Department of State, 8, maybe more, of that criteria. Some of that you see up there on the board. These are the ones we said that Marc satisfied. That he's a U.S. citizen and he was detained because he's a U.S. citizen, check. He was detained to influence the U.S. government. Remember, Anglo-American school, hostage situation, hostage trade, right, check. Credible reports of wrongful detentions in Russia. So the U.S. consulate, the State Department, posted a big travel advisory warning, right? Do not travel to Russia because it's known for arbitrary, wrongful detentions. So that was Exhibit A. The system is susceptible to corruption. He has the reports on that. Inhumane conditions. And, Marc was held in inhumane conditions. I mean, if you go and Google, Russian penal colonies, you're going to get the parade of horribles. I'm not going to spend any time on that. And specifically to Marc. Marc has gotten hundreds of injections, allegedly to treat him. And those were used basically as an excuse when we complained about him not being medically treated properly. The Russian consulate in D.C. produced this paper that said, well, wait a minute, we treated him. We took him to hospitals. No one spoke English in those hospitals, right? And here's a person who's already vulnerable, is getting these injections and pills. And when he asks, what are they? No one can tell him. No one will tell him, even if they understood his language. Due process. I just told you about the trial, right? We're not going to spend much time on that. The 11th factor right there that sort of got cut off is U.S. diplomatic efforts are necessary to bring that person home, right? And this is important to keep in mind, right? We couldn't bring Marc home. It took the U.S. government. We just had to impress it upon the U.S. government that it has no way out of this. So The executive branch received the petition and application for the Levinson Act, designation as wrongfully detained, the resolutions that came out of Congress, and then eventually, seeing lack of results from those efforts, Melvin Fogel, Marc's mom, was the plaintiff in the lawsuit against Anthony Blinken, against the Secretary of State, that said, hey, the Levinson Act says you shall review Marc's case, you shall make a determination. Shall is not may, probably could, why don't you? Shall. And you have not done your job. And so that's mandamus and that's APA. I'm not going to bore you with the legal mumbo jumbo, but just, we got the judiciary branch plugged in too. In response to that, we got a report from the State Department. The report went to address the resolution asking for a report on Marc Fogel. And in that report, that was, by the way, 2 pages. I believe it's a public record, and I believe it is attached to at least one of the filings under the lawsuit, so you can easily find it there. 2 pages, lots of errors, more than I've ever seen in a document, including probably my kids' grade school compositions, right? On those 2 pages. They got the articles wrong. So remember 228, 2291, kind of easy, you guys remembered. The State Department did not. Those are wrong. One of the articles talked about intent. You had to have intent. And so they said, well, hey, he came into the country and he was charged under this article because he had intent. Well, wrong article, right? So you would have read a lot about intent and how he said that he had it or whatever else. And then probably the most egregious thing that the US government did here. Remember I told you the appeals, right, that got kicked out of court. Well, the judge, when we showed her the precedent, hey, Your Honor, you gave, sitting in this very court, you gave 14 years to murderers, to rapists, to people who ran cartels and imported hundreds of pounds of cocaine into the country. That's the sentence you gave them. People who brought in less than an ounce of marijuana or had it in their possession got like 3 years suspended, right? Probation. Or several months in jail. What's up? The judge there did not say, well, this sentence is not unprecedented. I'm just going to give it. The judge said, hey, we don't have precedent. I have to follow it. It is what it is. This is the sentence. Deal with it. The U.S. government justified that sentence. I just like that to impress that upon you, right? So we talked about lack of due process in Russia, right? This is not Russia. This is United States of America. They went a step further. They said, oh, no, this sentence is fine. How can you do that? They had a trial in Russia. They didn't have a trial here. Marc didn't have an opportunity to present an explanation, to argue his case, anything like that. This report said, no, the sentence is not unprecedented, right? In the face of all of these statistics that said that, yeah, in fact, it is. Quick little note on the free press, because by that point, Marc's case was blowing up all over the place, including the national media, including the Wall Street journals, including the New York Times, including the Washington Post. And before this case, let me rephrase it. Following this case, remember, I lived in the Soviet Russia. I was born and raised there. I got to live and function in the Russian Federation as it is today, post-Soviet Union. And most of my life, actually, I've spent in the United States, over 30 years. So following this case, I've realized that the differences between the two countries, and when it came to the free press is included in that assessment, are not as vast and not as huge as we tend to think of them. So big shout out to our local press, our local guys in Pittsburgh, the Trib Reviews, the Post Gazettes, everything else did a great job in pretty much highlighting whatever we wanted them to highlight in marks of whatever information we gave them. Let's put it this way. They edited, they published it, they did the work that the journalists do, and I'm very grateful for that. When we moved up to the national press, that was not always the case. There was a smear campaign going on in the State Department and to members of the Congress about Marc. And a lot of the times that investigation by the Ministry of Internal Affairs in Russia was quoted saying like, hey, they have a reason to suspect he ran some kind of a cartel selling drugs to kids, right? Again, this is coming from the US government. Russia didn't even put those allegations on trial because they knew how ridiculous they were, right? But there was a video. And so we got that thrown into our face a few times. And the press sometimes picked it up. Sometimes, when we would give this information to the press about Marc Fogel, the details, the context, everything else, they would respond with a couple of text messages over there from Drew Hinshaw, a Wall Street Journal reporter, on this here phone. The article that they were allegedly writing, they were writing in August of 24, I believe it is. That article was advised to not be published. And the reporters took that advice, not from us. You can see my text messages, let's go with this article, right? At that point, we were still hoping that following the big swap, the big prisoner swap, we could still get Marc out, right? Let's go with the article. Family's okay with it. We're all on board with it. Let's just please go. This article got published on February 12th, right, 2025, when Marc Fogel was in the country. And the reason that it contained the information that it did, even though it was given to them in August, is because the family refused basically to speak with them, and that's all the material they had to run with. So that article had the stuff that we had given them to publish before, and if they did, like they said they would, Marc might have been home sooner. So that's a little commentary in the free press. Make Marc. So from the depressing things onto the grassroots movement, the very first slide I showed you had a mural, picture of a mural in Georgetown that the Foley Foundation runs. And that's the foundation run by Diane Foley in honor of her son, James Foley, who was very unfortunately detained and then horribly executed. And so she helps those Americans wrongfully detained, helps them come home. And so that mural has faces of all Americans currently wrongfully detained. Marc's face is not on it. They refused to include him until he gets an official designation. And even after he got the official designation, they refused to include him. So go figure. We made our own. So in Pittsburgh, we had over 100 artists participating. It was a grassroots movement, Make a Marc. I mentioned that in my former life I was an artist, so I believe in art being a very powerful tool of advocacy, and we had certainly got, to people who wouldn't have gotten to otherwise simply by putting this in the language that everybody can speak, right? Picture can speak those 1,000 words. And then another champion that I'd like to mention is Malphine Fogel. Malphine is Marc's 96 now, year-old mother. And this lady was up for just about anything. Anytime there was a doubt, and remember I mentioned this, right? So there is no pattern. So we had worked with, I mentioned Ambassador Eric Rubin. We worked with Ambassador Tom Pickering. He was ambassador to Russia for a period of time. We worked with Ambassador McFall, whose children attended the Anglo-American school. He knew Marc's family very well. And they've opened all sorts of doors at the State Department for us. Malphine was up for anything and everything. Whenever the family was not sure about filing the lawsuit, Malphine said, well, I'll be the plaintiff. Not a problem. Whenever the family was hesitant about approaching then not quite yet a President Trump, a candidate, Malphine said, I'll go to the rally. That's okay. It's happening in Butler, in my hometown. It's 10 minutes away from my home, I'll go. If you're thinking, oh my God, is that rally in Butler? It is that rally in Butler. So the picture that you see here is about 10 minutes before Trump went on stage. He first met with Malfin. Malfin grabbed onto his arm, said, remember Marc Fogel's name. Remember his name. You need to bring my boy home. And Trump apparently said, if I'm elected president, I'm going to do that. Take it for what you must. But he went on stage. He was supposed to ask Malfin to come out on stage and say a couple of words about the hometown teacher. And when the shots rang out, Malfin was sitting right next to the gentleman who got killed, unfortunately. So she was up in the bleachers, ready to go on stage. So we were right there. It was not a fun experience. And following that, to say the least, following that, this lady never backed down. Again, she filed a lawsuit. She went to every meeting. She was in press conferences. She did everything she could. She wrote a letter to President Putin. She wrote a letter to Beseda. She wrote a letter to Bortnikov saying, bring my child home. I saw you make a sign of a cross. We pray to the same God. You love your children. I love my son. I want to see him before I die. So there's our Malfin. And Marc is now home. So standing here before you, I don't know what worked. And talking to everybody we spoke with Mickey Bergman of the Global Reach, the former Richardson Foundation. I mentioned the ambassadors. We spoke to Peter Maggs, who is considered to be one of the greatest experts on Russia, Russian law, and certainly, hostage exchanges. We've done a variety of things. So besides everything I mentioned, we've asked for humanitarian release. We've filed a prisoner transfer petition for Marc Fogel to be transferred into the United States to serve his sentence out here. We went to the press. We went to everybody who would listen. We worked on the U.S. side. We worked on the Russian side as well, as much as we could. We had people engaged. By people, I mean members of Congress engaged with the Russian consulate, with the Russian embassy, right to Antonov. Got some very interesting responses from there. Worked with the Pennsylvania senators, Fetterman, Casey. Family met with them. Family met with Marco Rubio. Marc was officially designated as wrongfully detained in October. We were told to keep quiet about it, and the family decided to do that. It wasn't until December when that became known. However, the designation preceded the election by very little, let's put it this way. And then in the month of February, we knew, now at that point with the designation, as Marc was wrongfully detained, he was able to coordinate with SPIHA, so the special envoy. The family was being kept updated. Before that, they were in complete dark about where Marc was and what his chances were and what the negotiations that were going on. And we've heard from various sources in the beginning of February that he was moved from his facility in Rybinsk. There were all rumors. This was very anxiety-inducing. It was not until we got a call from Marc from that plane, which some of you may have watched, telling us that he left Russian airspace. He's on his way home. He went to the San Antonio facility to debrief, as is the protocol for anybody who has been wrongfully detained for a period of time. He's back in home in Pittsburgh. And again, I had some interesting takeaways from working on this case. I'd love to hear yours. I know I went well over time. That was allotted to me, but it is, and I've probably didn't include half of what I could have, because there's a lot of nuances there as well. But I welcome your thoughts, questions, comments, whatever you may have. Whatever I can answer, I will. But I'd love to hear what you think about what I just said, and think back to those three things that you did not know before the end of this presentation that maybe you now do.
I Well, first of all, thank you so much for coming here.
Absolutely.
I mean, for the work you've done for all this. This is truly a powerful story. So just thank you, first of all. My question is, I'm trying to understand the behavior of the government, the press. It seems just indifference to Fogel's case. So could you explain that? Why do you think they didn't do their due diligence, or it seems like they didn't care about Marc, or they didn't want to do the work to get him home?
All right. I'll take it one step further, if I may. My personal opinion of this, and again, this is a personal opinion, indifference would have been better, right? The smear campaign that originated from the U.S. government on, what he must have done or some potential bad acts that might have happened, right? Which no evidence was ever presented. He has no criminal history, right? So there's nothing. Some of the issues with the press, the report that we received from the State Department, right, saying that the sentence is not unprecedented, completely misstating certain facts, everything else. So I would take it a step further. It's not indifference in what I saw. There could be various reasons for this. I don't know any of them for sure. As you mentioned, Marc is not a celebrity. You didn't mention this, but Marc is not a celebrity. He's just a teacher. He's not Brittany Griner. So Brittany Griner was designated as wrongfully detained almost immediately. Brittany Griner is Brittany Griner. She had her organizations lobbying for her, sports associations lobbying for her. Marc had his friends, family, teachers, local politicians sending letters on his behalf. Certainly nowhere near Brittany Griner. He didn't have the resources. It's a middle-class family. They had to sell their house and move somewhere simpler to be able to cover some of the costs and expenses. Now, the lawyers were all pro bono on the U.S. side, meaning free. There were some expenses on the Russian side. They paid those lawyers, especially the dream team that came in initially. So he was not a celebrity. He's not wealthy. He's not well known, right? So that may be a reason. Reason number two, wrongfully detained designation obligates the U.S. government to expand an incredible amount of resources for that person, to keep track of where they are, to provide medical care if they need to provide travel expenses to their family lobbying, in D.C., for example, if they wanted to travel, to even get on the plane and get him home. That flight to Russia by Steve Witkoff was obviously not free, right? That comes from the U.S. government resources if somebody is wrongfully detained. If they're not, they don't have to do that. So that may be a reason. Resources, right? And then also, if you think about the Russia-U.S. relations, there was a limited amount to what U.S. government could do, especially at the time. And perhaps in anticipation that, hey, they don't quite have the resources right now to get Marc out, maybe that was the reason. None of it was justified, in my opinion, and certainly not the smear campaign and not the lack of due process that they afforded their own citizen, and worse due process, right, than if you're comparing to the Russian Federation. I hope that answers your question. Mm-hmm. Yep.
Thank you again for coming here. It was a fascinating topic with several interesting points, but talking more about this wrongfully detained status and the lack thereof, I know you said at the beginning no to hostage situations or unite, and that makes it difficult to study, but can you, in your experience and perhaps any reading you did, has the United States done this before? Failure to identify someone as wrongfully detained when perhaps they should, and is that also in subservience to some, maybe a grand strategy per se?
So I probably won't be able to comment on the grand strategy because I still don't know what that is. But the wrongfully detained designation, so has United States government, has it done it before, has failed to designate somebody as wrongfully detained when the factors were present. The short answer is very likely. There is one other lawsuit that's pending. Don't quote me on the name, I believe it's James Wilgus, but I may be mixing up the first name. So there's another lawsuit made just after the one we filed in Marc Fogel, saying that that person should have been designated as wrongfully detained and was not. Wrongfully detained designations do not come immediately, right? So there is a period of review that happens. And does the US government gets it right every time? I seriously doubt that, right? But as far as the precedent goes, since the inception of the Levinson Act, the wrongfully detained, or let me back up actually, anybody who came from Russia who was returned to the United States by the US government, and that's Trevor Reed, Evan Gershkovich, Paul Whelan, right, Brittany Griner, Ksenia Karelina, actually the most recent one, every single one of them has been designated as wrongfully detained. No one came without the designation. We've heard from the State Department time and time again, hey, if you have a blue passport, you're good. That we're working as hard on your case as we are on all others. That has not been my experience. And so without the designation, you can come home. Whether or not there's some others out there who are detained, I believe there are 20, maybe more Americans right now detained in Russia. One is currently designated, who's still there, as wrongfully detained. Everybody else, could they be? Well, yeah, possibly, right? I mean, as Marc was coming home, February 11th, February 12th, I believe it is, they picked somebody up at the Sheremetyevo airport with the, was it half a kilo of marijuana, little candy, cannabis candy or whatever else. And that person was detained for like 2 days. That tells you a little bit more about the precedent, right? And like basically released, an American citizen. Could there be others? Yes. Could there be others who haven't hit the news? Yes. Marc was arrested for quite some time before any news reports appeared. So, but the strategy behind it, that beats me.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Yes, sir.
So I'm going to give you the opportunity to address an issue that's come up, with this talk on campus, and I would love your thoughts on it. Given the outrage that you reported about Marc Fogel, do you feel the legal community today, as a whole, has an obligation to speak out about not U.S. citizens necessarily, but people like Ksenia Petrova, who's now in a Louisiana jail after being a Harvard researcher because she brought some frog samples back through with the wrong paperwork through a U.S. airport, or Garcia, who's been deported to El Salvador and admittedly wrongfully, according to ICE itself. Is this a general pattern of governments not paying attention to habeas corpus, wrongfully detaining people, or do you see these as sharply distinct?
So that's a great question. I'll go back to the first part of your question, right? Do we have an obligation? Ethically, professionally, our obligations are spelled out as attorneys, right? Are spelled out in the Code of Professional Conduct, in the rules and regulations that govern us and everything else. Our moral obligation, each one of us has to decide for themselves. This particular case, a partner called me up in August of 2021 and said, "Hey, there's there's an inquiry coming in. There is an American citizen detained abroad. Could you do something about it? It's probably going to be like just helping with translation or like running some type of coordination with the Russian team." And I said, I don't have time. I can recommend translators, whatever else. So they came back to me a couple of days later and said, no, they really sort of maybe need you to even take a look at it if you could. And so I did. And in looking at it, well, okay, we probably get him out quickly. This is not something that they're going to detain somebody. It wasn't until I got into what this truly was, with the Anglo-American school, with the targeting and everything else, that's where my moral obligation kicked in, right? And especially when we realized the State Department is not going to recognize this or act on it. The press is not going to pick this up. Oh yeah, I absolutely have an obligation to make this known and to point out all the differences and the wrongs. What you saw on the slide as the State Department report, the little squib from it, the 2 pages. The statistics underneath was a snip from a 20-page response that I filed. This is all pro bono, right? I bill at $800 an hour, free of charge to the family and everybody else, to the State Department, exactly doing what you just said, pointing out all of the injustices and pointing out to the U.S. government that it shall not, it cannot, it must not convict, right, its citizens without giving them an opportunity to present their case, right? We can't do this. And so in that, I see great similarities. You cannot do certain things, right, without undermining the very principles of democracy we stand on. Unfairness and injustice, and that's why we fought for Marc's case so hard, right? It's not that he was, all of those things that he was sentenced and everything else, that's the Russian side of things, but he was being treated unfairly here at home, right, by the government. His face on the mural, not there, right? Even in such minor things. Unfairness and injustice for one is unfairness and injustice for all. You can't say, oh, we live in this amazing, democratic society, but then we're just going to sweep all of these things under the rug and pretend they don't exist, right? So I really hope that it does trigger a moral obligation or a moral response for attorneys to the extent that they can make a difference there, right? Because remember that 11th Levinson Act factor is the U.S. government still has to correct those things. You can't do them privately. It's impossible. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you very much.
We have time for one more question.
Okay. Yeah.
So one of the things I was thinking about in this process, again, you can assign all sorts of motives and ideas and theories behind the actions of people that you can't figure out what they're doing.
Right.
And it's just difficult to know. And as a social scientist, when you say it's sort of random, the part of my brain is like, no, there must be something going on here and trying to figure it out. So now I'm on the intellectual side, I'm quite curious about this, even though my heart's broken by the story.
Right.
But one of the things I'm just curious if you ever came across is it sort of takes two to tango. Like if the U.S. government designates Marc as such, then does that raise the status? Like you talked about, he didn't have the celebrity, he didn't have the things. Is there any world, like they think there's a transaction coming, and the problem is that the more valuable the person is, the more you have to give up. So is part of this bargaining, and I hate to use this analogy because it's humans we're talking about, but you're bargaining at the used car dealership and you're kicking the tires, you say, who would want this car? No one wants this. Fine, I'll give you $1,000. Was there ever any sense that maybe the U.S. government is piling on so that when they say, all right, Russia, it seems like people want Marc back, we'll give you some low-level person and not some high-level asset because this is going to be a bargain. Is there any, would anyone ever push back in this way? Because it just seems so puzzling and tragic. Yeah.
So that's a great question. The very short answer is yes. The more nuanced answer, we were wondering from the very beginning as we were talking with the State Department, why was it that the State Department kept saying, no, keep this quiet, keep this quiet. If you raise his profile, the Russians will understand that Americans want him. Yeah. And the response from our team was well, why is that a bad thing?
Right.
That's what we want. No, because then, they'll ask for more than we can give, and this is not, so there were those discussions there, of course. And that would have been a great reason, right, for the State Department, or an explanation, right, for the actions of the State Department before the Levinson Act. But with the inaction of the Levinson Act, right, you no longer have to say, hey, the Russians asked for me, and therefore I should be wrongfully detained, or I should become a priority, or whatever else. I'm sure that was the process then. Following the Levinson Act, here are the 11 criteria. You satisfy one of these, and you're a good candidate for the Levinson Act. There's discretion, absolutely, but the Secretary of State shall review and shall determine based on those 11 criteria, right? So it would have worked as an explanation before. In our mind and in our argument, right, a very vocal argument that we advanced, it no longer did following the Levinson Act. And we'll see what happens to the Levinson Act and what happens to the lawsuits. We withdrew ours. It's another point to make really, really quick. If you guys wanted to take a look at this, right? So all of this is very public and on the public dockets. So we only got to the government filing the motion to dismiss, us responding to it, and the government filing their reply. In that reply, the tactic that the government used was United States government has full discretion, right, to figure things out when it comes to foreign policy. Well, it's an interesting concept. I'm not going to bore you with this. I can talk about this for 2 hours alone. But we're talking about Levinson Act, right, domestic statute, about a U.S. citizen, right, about U.S. citizens' family, because the benefits go to them too, here in the United States, setting out 11 factors of a designation by a State Department, right, here in the United States, right, on the wrongful detention that grant benefits to that citizen here in the United States. How is that foreign policy, right? I don't know. So watch that one. That's going to be interesting to see what happens to those lawsuits. But yes is a short answer. Who knows is a nuanced one.
All right, thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you, guys.